Welcome back to the Victory Degree podcast. Today, I'm joined by Aaron Schatz. Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me back on.
First repeat guest of the podcast. If you want, we can send you a trophy or something. You know,
sure. I'll put
could be valuable one day. But no, it's an honor to get to talk to you again. We last spoke December of last year. We were talking about my Niners and what their Super Bowl odds were looking like. You were telling everybody that the Eagles, despite their good record, are maybe a little fake and it might not be as good as what they seem. And I actually went back and listened to what you had to say on Pardon My Take before the playoffs last year. And you were telling everyone that you had the Buccaneers slightly favored over the Eagles in that wild card matchup.
Yeah.
And despite what we had seen and despite what you had written about the Eagles, that still seemed kind of crazy at the time, just given the Eagles' record and their track record in the playoffs and Hurts and all this stuff. But lo and behold, you were right.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't right about everything last year. The Ravens, were my number one team, and they didn't win it all. But the Eagles was a team I was very right on last year.
Do you ever is there like a Mahomes factor? Might be a dumb question, but when
I don't know how to put that. Listen, Tom Brady won every year until he didn't. Until 2005 came, and people thought, well, the Patriots are just going to walk through the playoffs again, but they weren't as good as the previous years, and they lost. Another good example is the 1990 49ers had won 2 straight Super Bowls and started 10-0, and they must have looked unbeatable. And then they didn't make it to the Super Bowl that year. So nothing is guaranteed.
So let's start here. We started talking about Mahomes and the Chiefs. What are you seeing from Kansas City? Maybe we can dive into some of the advanced stats about them. What I see is a quarterback who's been underperforming thus far. He had a great game last night, arguably the best game of the season so far for Mahomes. But I see a quarterback that's mostly underperformed, and that's been slightly carried by that defense.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Now, they added a number one receiver, right, which is a huge, big deal. The Chiefs are, this will sound weird, a run-of-the-mill Super Bowl contender, not a super ridiculous, undefeated juggernaut. Like, they're third in my DVOA ratings this year. That's a Super Bowl contender right there. Like, let's ignore their win-loss record. They're third. The third best team is a very strong Super Bowl contender. But they're not playing what you would imagine the image of the Chiefs to be. 25 teams since 1979 have started the year 8-0. And of those 25 teams, the Chiefs rank 18th. Now, again, they added DeAndre Hopkins, right? The 1990 49ers didn't get to add DeAndre Hopkins halfway through the year. But this is not the 96 Packers. This is not, the 91 Redskins. This is a pretty darn good team that may not be the best team in the league this year.
When you look at Mahomes and some of his stats, obviously, again, this is all pre-Hopkins, because last night that connection looked pretty darn good, and we'll see how that plays out rest of season. But when you look at Mahomes thus far, what are you seeing out of his quarterback play?
I mean, they don't get the ball downfield very much, which is something that they did more of this week. Mm-hmm. And he's been throwing interceptions. Not necessarily all his fault, but he has thrown interceptions every week until this week. So he has been like the 12th best quarterback in the league this year or something. He has not been what you think of when you think of Patrick Mahomes.
And yet, if the Detroit Lions, and we'll get into some of the DVOA stuff, if the Detroit Lions played the Chiefs tomorrow on the neutral field, who would you take?
The Lions.
You take the Lions over Mahomes?
Wait. No, not tomorrow. Next week, once Zadarius Smith understands how the scheme works, I guess I would take the Lions. Give him a week to learn. Give me a week to learn how to play for the Lions. But the Lions are the better team this year. The Lions, I know Mahomes is special and has magic beans and everything. They still needed overtime to beat San Francisco last year in that Super Bowl. Like, the Lions have just been the better team this year.
And the Lions easily could have made the Super Bowl last year, which is scary for everyone this year, especially in the NFC.
Their defense is better this year than it was last year.
So what do you attribute that to? Because so when Hutchinson went down, he was balling out. You cannot replace a guy like Hutch on the D line and everything that he brings.
I think learning the scheme, improved play in the secondary. They're definitely going to need more pass rush. There's no question about that.
Yeah, that offensive line. I mean, when Jared got, and we'll get into some of the MVP stuff here shortly, but just having, I feel like for a quarterback, just knowing that you have Montgomery and especially Gibbs back there and that O-line, and that really, whenever you need to pick up 4 or 5 yards, there's a good probability that you can, especially in that short yardage stuff. 3rd and 1. You can hand it off, and that there's a good shot that you'll pick up the first down.
Like, there's no question, if the Lions play the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, Campbell's aggressiveness is an advantage. Reed is not very aggressive, and Campbell will avoid giving the ball back to the Chiefs. And as long as they convert, 2/3 of those attempts, they'll keep the ball out of Mahomes' hands. But now we're getting very ahead of ourselves.
Right. Well, you can't forget about my 49ers, Aaron. Let us get a little healthy, get McCaffrey back. And I don't. I mean, it's going to be different this year.
Better than you think. We have them 5th, despite the 4-4 record, and that is not some kind of magic McCaffrey adjusted number. That's how they've actually performed, and they should be better with McCaffrey back.
Right. So let's do this. Let's get into it. So DVOA. Well, we had you on last year. You are the creator of DVOA, and I think people hear DVOA, and it's one of those stats that gets thrown around, but a lot of people don't actually know what it means. So let's start here. What is DVOA? And then in addition to DVOA, what are maybe 1 or 2 additional advanced stats that you think people should be aware about or can help predict the team's success?
Yeah, DVOA is the defense adjusted value over average. What we do is we assign a success value to every play based on the down and distance, and then we compare that to a league average that's adjusted for situation and opponent. So above 0 means you're better than average, and below 0 means you're worse than average. The other stat that gets thrown out a lot in the world of advanced stats is EPA, which is expected points added, which is how many points do you expect in this situation? And then let's say you get a 5-yard run, and now it's 2nd and 5. How many points would you expect to score in that situation? And whatever the difference is the expected points added of the play. Now, the difference is that DVOA is specifically tuned to try to be predictive and is adjusted for the opponents that you've played, and EPA is not.
So when I'm thinking about DVOA, like let's say a team has a 2nd and 5 and they gain 4 yards on that play.
Yeah.
Like how does that go into this calculation? Like how does that work? I'm trying to think of like a real world example.
60% of the yards to get 1 success point. So that would be 80% of the yards. So I think you get like 2 success points. And then whatever the baseline is gets compared, and then it goes from there.
And the baseline is just the league average.
Yeah, of what an average team would do on 2nd and 5 on that part of the field. Yeah.
Okay, so let's
things like the score at the end of games and whether you're in a dome and a bunch of other stuff.
Oh, so it is adjusted for whether or not you're in a dome, because I feel like that would probably factor into the Lions score, right? Because what is it? They play like 3 outdoor games all year or something.
The Lions have a better defensive DVOA and a worse offensive DVOA than you would expect otherwise, because I'm adjusting for the fact that they have played all their games except 1 indoors.
Okay. So let's get into the top 5. This is total DVOA. And I'm looking at your list here. You got Detroit at 46.1%. You got Baltimore at 37.7%. Kansas City at 29.1%. Minnesota at 25.7, and Buffalo at 21.2.
Yeah.
So when I'm looking at these percentages,
San Francisco is also at 21.2.
Correct. So when I'm looking at these percentages, how do I interpret that?
It's hard to do. I created a stat that's a little hard to explain. It's basically like efficiency over average, but you're like, efficiency is measured by what? And the answer is success points. And you're like, what's a success point? And then go down a rabbit hole.
Okay. So, but from the list, these are based on DVOA. These are the 5 best teams we mentioned. So again, Detroit, Baltimore, Kansas City, Minnesota, Buffalo, and San Francisco tied for that 5 spot.
Yes.
So let's compare that now to the current Super Bowl odds. And you did a little playoff breakdown as well, which we'll get into some of these percentages as well.
Yes.
But comparing that to Super Bowl odds, Kansas City is the current favorite, and yet they're 3rd in DVOA. How do you explain that discrepancy?
We have Kansas City 2nd in Super Bowl odds because of the fact that they're 8-0. It means they're likely to get the number 1 seed. But we have Detroit number 1 in our Super Bowl odds.
So Super Bowl odds based on odds makers. So odds makers
my Super Bowl odds are based on a simulation that's based on DVOA and how often teams with a certain DVOA beat other teams and so on. So my Super Bowl I'll call them probabilities, right? So that we don't think they're market odds. My probabilities have the Lions as the number 1 team likely to win the Super Bowl, with Kansas City 2nd.
Right. And you also have Detroit at a 65% chance of a conference championship appearance and a 47.8% chance of a conference championship win. I mean, a 50-50 shot basically of making the Super Bowl I think speaks volumes to how good they've been this year.
Yeah, I mean, I have to tweak my simulation a little bit. I do have a habit of slightly overrating the best teams. So the fact is Kansas City and Detroit are probably a little lower than this. But Detroit, because here's the thing, right? Not only is Detroit the best team in my ratings, but the other teams in my ratings, Baltimore is an AFC team. Kansas City is an AFC team. Minnesota will be a wild card if Detroit wins the division. San Francisco is going to have to go to Detroit. Buffalo is an AFC team. Like you see, like the AFC has better teams, and the teams in the NFC are going to have to go to Detroit because we see Detroit with such a strong chance of getting the number 1 seed. So that just makes it more likely that they're going to move on.
Let me bring up a stat here that really caught my eye. 17-0. Kansas City, from the looks of it, is the only non-0% chance team.
Yes, they're the only undefeated team, right? Yep.
Right, of going 17-0. And I think you had tweeted earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday, their odds, basically what's the most likely game that they could lose?
At Buffalo, week 11.
At Buffalo. Okay, so that would be the 2 versus the 4 matchup. Wait, sorry.
But there's a very good chance that they lose at some point. It's very, very hard. We only give them a 5.7% chance to go undefeated. Even if they win the next 2 games and get past Buffalo, we only give them a 15.6% chance of going undefeated. Because you get to week 17 and 18, they have to go to Pittsburgh and to Denver. And that doesn't even adjust for the fact that Andy Reid might sit starters and not care about going 17-0. It's really hard to do.
So that you beat me to it. That was going to be my next question is once you get into week 18, I mean, if they have, let's say they have the 1 seed locked up, I mean, what's the incentive to play Mahomes or Kelce or any of these guys?
Incentive. But
I guess.
But to me, the chances that they even make it to week 18 undefeated are very slim. They're going to lose somewhere along.
Yeah, I hope so. I hate the Chiefs.
They might lose only once. And then they'll lose in week 18, and they'll end up 15-2. That's very possible. But they're going to lose it.
So let's talk more about the AFC and about teams that could potentially dethrone Kansas City, because that is my favorite topic to talk about, how Kansas City can lose. So Aaron, I'm hoping you can maybe shed some light on some teams that could dethrone Kansas City. We obviously know about Baltimore. We know about Buffalo. Let's start with Baltimore. When I look at Baltimore, I years past, they have been the regular season. They've won the regular season championship in years past, and they always seem poised to beat Kansas City, and yet they haven't been able to do it. Do you see any difference between this year's Baltimore team and from years past? Maybe it has something to do with that big old running back they got in the offseason.
They're better on offense and not as good on defense and special teams as years past. We have Baltimore as the 5th best offense ever through 9 games. Their offense is ridiculous this year. I think they have something like the highest yards per carry of any team ever, and like the 2nd highest yards per rip pass of any team ever. And that, they're not necessarily going to keep that up for the whole year, but their offense is just absolutely fantastic. But their pass defense is a serious problem, and their special teams are not as good as years past.
Can you just repeat? 5th best offense of all time?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, through 9 games.
So I guess, remember that quote in the offseason where Jerry Jones was like, or I think he said it maybe earlier this year. He's like, yeah, we didn't really want Derrick Henry because basically along the lines of,
Henry's
he's like,
I have Henry as the 2nd most valuable rusher behind Jahmyr Gibbs.
And how do you calculate most valuable rusher?
That's the DYAR stat that's based on value above replacement. It kind of takes DVOA and turns it into a total stat rather than a rate stat. And it has Jahmyr Gibbs number 1 and Derrick Henry 2, and then a big gap before you get to everyone else.
Interesting. Okay. So Baltimore, we're aware of the offense, 5th best all time. Defense has taken a step back, especially their pass defense. Special teams is iffy this year compared to years past. What about Buffalo? Buffalo is one of those teams I can't figure out. And I want to draw the parallel to Philadelphia from last year. I don't think that's necessarily, I don't know if that's true or not, but Buffalo has seemed beatable, but yet they keep winning. So what's the deal with Buffalo?
Last year. Way better than Philadelphia last year. Not as good as Buffalo has been at their best, but way better than what Philadelphia was last year. Their defense is a little bit above average. It's not as good as it's been in the past. Their offense has been great. And adding Amari Cooper gives them that number 1 receiver, even though he didn't play this last week. So, I mean, listen, I'm sorry to write off Pittsburgh and Houston and whoever else, but that's Kansas City's competition. Baltimore and Buffalo. That's the competition.
I'm hoping my boy Keon Coleman from FSU, he's shown that he belongs and he's had some big games, but he just seems inconsistent, which could be a rookie thing and just finding his footing in the league. But
and look, Buffalo and Baltimore both a little bit more inconsistent than Kansas City, which means that if they have one of their good days, they can easily beat Kansas City, or they could have one of their bad days and not even get to Kansas City.
Yeah. How do you factor in, we talked about the dome, but when it comes to the playoffs and outdoor games, Baltimore, Buffalo, Kansas City, these are all places where it could get pretty cold pretty fast. So how does that factor into?
Yeah, I don't really do anything to try to factor that in. It's it's cold for both teams, even if you're used to the indoors. It's cold for both teams. So I don't really try to adjust for that. Home field advantage tends to just be home field advantage.
So like last year when Miami went to Kansas City and that cold game.
Yeah. I mean, it was super ridiculously cold for both teams. Home field advantage. Kansas City has home field advantage. And that was an extreme situation also. So you had a warm weather team going to like the coldest game of all time. It's very unlikely that you're going to have another game like that. You don't build models based on extremes.
Okay, fair enough. So Aaron, as we wrap up the AFC, we look at the odds, we see the DVOA, the odds makers have Kansas City favored. What's your prediction on who comes out of the AFC?
I think it's going to be Kansas City because of that home field advantage. I would love to see it be Baltimore. It would be fun to see it be Buffalo. I think that home field advantage, as good as Baltimore is playing on offense, the fact that Kansas City is going to be better with Hopkins and they're going to have the home field advantage, it just makes them more likely to come out. I wouldn't be surprised if they make it to the Super Bowl again.
Yeah, speaking of Baltimore, I'm looking at, you have matchup odds as well. Detroit versus Baltimore is your second highest odds at 14% for the Super Bowl matchup.
Yes, Detroit versus Kansas City is our highest.
Yeah, Detroit versus Kansas City. Yep, you're right. Highest at 18.2. Detroit versus Baltimore, and then Detroit versus Buffalo. Then it goes Washington versus Kansas City, which I want to get to Washington here shortly. And then rounding out the top 5 is Detroit versus Houston, which would be interesting. I don't know. I like look at that on paper, and that doesn't seem like a Super Bowl matchup to me. But I mean, we'll see what Houston can do out of the AFC. All right, let's move on to the NFC, my conference. The conference that seems like it has a little more variance. I mean, once you get past the Lions are clearly at the top, but like that 2 through 5.
Yeah, there's a number of good teams, whereas the AFC has a lot of teams that just really suck this year.
Yeah,
the NFC just has the Panthers.
Poor Panthers. Yeah, the NFC, it seems like, again, that like 2 to 5 is like wide open. Like you could talk me into Philadelphia, you could talk me into the San Francisco 49ers, you could talk me into Green Bay with a healthy Jordan Love. I mean, what do your stats say about the NFC once we get past the Lions?
I think the thing to remember is that offense tends to be more predictive and consistent than defense. So even though we have Minnesota higher in DVOA because of their defense being the best in the league, by my number, Washington and San Francisco have better offenses, especially with CMC back, which means is more likely to be predictive. And Washington and San Francisco are more likely to win division titles and get home games, whereas Minnesota is likely to have to go on the road. So that's why the Super Bowl odds see Washington as the second most likely team to make it out of the NFC rather than Minnesota.
Because explain that one more time. I don't think I caught.
Washington is more likely to make it out of the NFC than Minnesota, even though Minnesota has a higher rating, because Washington is going to get home games. Whereas Minnesota is very likely going to lose their division to Detroit and have to go on the road and win 3 on the road.
Got it. And so when you're running these simulations, I'm just so curious. Like, what are the inputs? Like, what are you inputting into?
It's the DVOA of each team and who's at home.
Okay.
It's a pretty simple formula for the playoff odds.
Okay, so you mentioned Washington. We might as well talk about them. Jane Daniels has been a revelation. I actually went back and I looked at some of the rookie quarterback stuff because people talk about Washington making the Super Bowl, and I just want to pump the brakes a little bit because rookie quarterbacks, not only is it rare for them to make the Super Bowl, a rookie quarterback has never made a Super Bowl. And I went back and I looked at some of the recent rookie quarterback playoff performances. So Brock Purdy, 2022, you could argue was the best rookie quarterback performance if you're just looking at basic stats. So wins 2 games, gets injured in the Philadelphia game, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 190 yards a game. Mark Sanchez in 2009 won 2 playoff games, 4 touchdowns, 2 picks, 180 yards a game. Joe Flacco in 2008, 146 yards a game, 1 touchdown, 3 picks. Then you get to CJ Stroud, last year, 2 games played, 224 yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 picks. Kind of go through the list, and it's rare for a rookie quarterback to win even a single game. Russell Wilson, 2012, 286 yards a game, 3 touchdowns, 1 pick. So the rookie quarterback thing is interesting with Washington, obviously because of Daniels. What are you seeing out of them, and what's your?
Subjectively, I like San Francisco better than Washington because I think if CMC comes back and turns their offense back into what we think it can be, and Purdy has more experience and Shanahan has more experience calling offense in playoffs, whatever, that I think I like San Francisco better than Washington to be the team that goes to Detroit in the NFC Championship game. But Washington's offense is really, really good this year. They're number 2 in my ratings behind Baltimore. And I don't think it matters that a rookie's never made it to the Super Bowl. I think the Washington offense is good enough to make it to the Super Bowl. and they just added Marshawn Lattimore to their defense.
Yeah, that was a big pickup for them. Cornerback has been an area of struggle. I want to stick on this rookie quarterback thing just for a little bit more, because it is pretty interesting. So Justin Herbert, 2020, 4,300 yards. And then you go to Baker Mayfield, 2018. Let me see, 3,700 yards. I don't know why it's not showing the touchdowns. So you go through some of these rookie quarterback performances, and Jaden Daniels, Herbert, 31 touchdowns his rookie year. Baker, 27 touchdowns. Russell Wilson, 26. Daniels has 9, but he has 4 rushing, and he has basically 2,000 yards. When you compare it to some of the rookie quarterback performances from the past, in your opinion, where does Daniels rank?
Yeah,
in
I think
terms
he's
of
on
competence?
pace to be like the 7th or 8th best rookie quarterback in total value. You know, he doesn't have the volume of some of those great rookie quarterbacks. Like, they use him a little. They've run fewer plays, and the running game is important. And but he's having a great year.
And so, what would your pitch be for Washington? Is it just based on their offense carrying them to the Super Bowl?
Second best offense in the league. Offense is more predictive than defense. They're very likely to be the number 2 seed in the NFC.
And when you say offense is more predictive than defense, is that just because fumbles, interceptions like that are more difficult to predict?
I don't know exactly why it is. There's a lot of there are a lot of theories as to why it is, but it is.
Okay, interesting. All right, so Washington, there's the case. The offense takes them far. Like you said, 2 seed. They won't have to play on the road until potentially the NFC Championship against Detroit. And they are currently. Let me look at the
San Francisco is Christian McCaffrey is coming back, and they are a more balanced team than Washington. Their offense has not been quite as good, but it should be better with CMC. Their defense is much better than Washington's. And maybe they go into Washington and they win anyway, and then they go to Detroit.
Yeah. So right now you have Washington at 33.7% to make the NFC Championship game. You have SF at 13%, which could change depending on how these next couple weeks go. Like you said, with McCaffrey's return, and then obviously how the 2 teams play as well. Washington 14% to make it to the Super Bowl. San Francisco at 5.7%. Let's talk about Philadelphia. We talked about them last year. You were down on them despite their record. What's your impression of Philly this year?
Yeah, better than I expected before the season. They're a good team. We have them 9th, just a little bit behind Washington, but of course they're a game behind Washington, or half a game, I guess, behind Washington. 7-2 versus 6-2. Mm-hmm. The Eagles are definitely dangerous.
20% to make the NFC Championship, 8%, 7.5% to win it, to go to Super Bowl, 3% on the Super Bowl title. And if we look at their offensive DVOA, they are middle of the pack. But when we take a look at their total DVOA, they are 9th. So yeah. Upper echelon team.
Yes, upper echelon team, absolutely. But not as good as Washington, because Washington's been better on offense. And I think also you got to give Washington a little credit for having just picked up Lattimore.
Right. So that's, in essence, kind of the NFC picture. You got Detroit, who's the clear number 1, and you got a bunch of teams. I guess we didn't touch on Green Bay, although maybe they're a little more difficult to predict just based off Jordan Love's injury.
They're a good team. They're about the same as Philadelphia. I don't quite know what's going on with Jordan Love's injury, though.
So they're 8th in total DVOA, which is honestly crazy considering that Jordan Love's missed 3 games, and even in some of the games that he's played, he hasn't been 100%.
Oh God, Matt LaFleur is a Coach of the Year candidate for the fact what he was able to do with Malik Willis.
Yeah. I mean, he made him look competent, which to be fair, Malik hasn't looked
not even competent. Good.
Right. Yeah. I have to ask, offensive masterminds in the NFL right now, it seems like we're going through a bit of a shift. It used to be Shanahan, and then you had all these people who branched off the Shanahan tree. And it seems like the LaFleurs, the McVays, they've outperformed, at least in my estimation, Shanahan in terms of some of the play calling, some of the play design. But do you think like who's I mean, is it Ben Johnson? Is he like if you had to pick your offensive coordinator?
It would be Ben Johnson.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah. He's been fantastic, and deserves to be a head coach, honestly, and should be one next year. That's for sure. So that's kind of the NFC playoff picture. Aaron, anything else to add in terms of who you see coming out of the NFC?
Not really. I mean, the Rams have a little bit of a danger with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp both healthy, but I just don't think their defense is good enough. You know, even though their defensive line played really well last week and against Seattle, and Jared Verse has been a Defensive Rookie of the Year candidate, I just don't think their defense is good enough. Yeah,
the Rams do scare me because what you just alluded to with Puka and Kupp coming back, and Kyren Williams, man, let's talk about underrated. Kyren Williams might be the number one overall pick in terms of underrated NFL players. A lot of people know him from fantasy and, you know, the work that he's been putting in there, but he always manages to find like 4 to 5 yards. I swear every time I watch him run, he like wiggles through and gets 5 yards, and I don't know how he does it.
Has really not been much of a thing this year.
Yeah, and that was like the talk of the town in the offseason, like, oh, you know, Blake Corum, Kyren Williams returning kicks. I mean,
hasn't been much of a thing.
Yeah. I thought this would be kind of fun to talk through. We've talked about some of the heavy hitters in both conferences, but let's talk about some teams that might be underperforming up to this point, and just your general thoughts on their ability to make the playoffs, what the stats say about their performance thus far, and how far you could maybe see them advancing. And then the first team I have to bring up is the Jets. So the Jets are sitting at 3-6. What have you seen?
Jets with like an 11% chance of making the playoffs. I have them lower than other sites because I think I don't think Rodgers is great anymore. I don't think the Jets are going to make the playoffs. No.
Even given I think I was looking at their schedule. They have a lot of, there's a lot of gimmies in there. I don't
think the gimmies are as gimme as you think they are.
Okay. Interesting. Let's see. Let me pull it up real quick, because I know everyone's talking about the Jets, and they're one of those teams where such high expectations coming into this year. So they play the Cardinals this week.
Yep. Not a gimme.
Not a gimme. You're right. The Cardinals have been good. Speaking of the Cardinals, that was another team on my list, and another team in the loaded NFC, the NFC West. What the Cardinals I also can't figure out. Like, is Kyler good? Like, is their offense good? Because
better than I expected. They're definitely contender to make it in as like a 6th or 7th seed. Sure.
I'm trying to see offensive DVOA. Yeah, I guess kind of middle of the pack here. 7.3%. 11th. Yeah, I guess, yeah, close to top 10. But then if we look at their defensive DVOA, is that where it drops off?
Average.
Yeah. Okay, so, you know, almost top 10 offense, middle of the pack defense. Kyler, who can always create, you know, and make a play or two. So the Jets play the Cardinals this week. Then they play the Colts next week with that. I guess Flacco is starting, but
yeah,
I mean,
good chance of a win, but not a gimme.
Yeah. What Anthony Richardson? Let's real quick before we get back to the Jets.
It's a question of how much you think Anthony Richardson learns on the bench. If you think he can learn on the bench almost as much as he would learn as a starter, then yeah, what the heck, put Flacco in and try to make the playoffs. If you think he learns a lot more as a starter, the main goal of this organization is to develop Anthony Richardson. You have to leave him in. I don't know the answer to that question. But to me, that's the question. Because the main goal of your organization is not to win the 7th seed and lose in the wild card round. The main goal of your organization is to develop Anthony Richardson.
I guess the pushback on that is from an owner's perspective and selling tickets and just operating as a business. If you're more competitive, it leads to more ticket sales.
You know what really leads to ticket sales is if you develop Anthony Richardson.
There you go.
And you're competing for Super Bowls.
Yeah.
In
fair
3
enough.
years.
Fair enough.
Look at the long game. You have to look at the long game.
Yeah. So the Jets play the Colts in New York, in New Jersey, actually. And then they're back at home against Seattle.
Not a gimme. Seattle's been up and down, but with those receivers, anything is possible. Then they play at Miami, at Jacksonville, Rams. At Miami, not a gimme with Tua back.
Yep.
At Jacksonville, close to a gimme.
I love that we're going through this list and we're hitting on all the quarterbacks I wanted to ask you about. Trevor Lawrence is next on my hit list of what the hell is happening with Trevor Lawrence, Aaron.
I remember someone tweeting this, and I'm sorry that I cannot attribute it. They tweeted, "Tonight is a battle of my two favorite quarterbacks, Josh Allen and the idea of Trevor Lawrence." The idea of Trevor Lawrence is so much more attractive than the reality of what Trevor Lawrence is. That being said, Trevor Lawrence, people who try to adjust advanced stats for things like drops and yak and stuff, Trevor Lawrence has not been done any favors by his receivers or by opponents dropping interception. Like, he's had bad luck. He's better than he looks.
Yeah, I want to believe in Trevor. Like you said, the idea of Trevor Lawrence.
I want to believe. We all want to believe. We want him to be good. We want him to be so good. I know. I'm with you.
And he has like the Andrew Luck body makeup, right? He's mobile. He has the arm. He's a big dude. He's everything you'd want in a quarterback. He's tall, right? Like he's everything you want in a quarterback, and that's why it's so frustrating watching him every Sunday, especially. I'm sure you caught at the end of that Philly game, they're down 5 and he throws basically a fade route to the backup running back. And me and the rest of the NFL were kind of questioning why is that the throw when you need 7 backup running back against the corner?
Whose decision is it? Is it the offensive coordinator? Was that the first read, or is that Trevor's decision? Did he go to a second or a third read? Like, I don't know for sure. But yeah, it was weird. Yeah.
So the Jets then after Jacksonville, they play home Rams, at Bills, and then home Dolphins. So 2 Miami games there.
These are not gimmies.
Oh, absolutely.
The only game on the schedule that comes close to being a gimme is Jacksonville. It's a lot of 50-50 games. And the thing about 50-50 games is you're probably going to win half of them. And you know what that makes you? 7-10.
Yeah. Aaron, I know what it is. I figured it out. We cracked the code. Just how people are enamored with the idea of Trevor Lawrence. People are enamored with the idea of Aaron Rodgers, Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, defense with the pieces that they have. They're enamored with the idea that the Jets are actually good and that they've had bad luck thus far this season.
It would be fun. I mean, no diss on Patrick Surtain. But the Jets in the playoffs are a much better story for us in the journalism world than Denver in the playoffs.
Right.
Denver in the playoffs, whatever. No one wants to talk about that. The Jets in the playoffs? Eyeballs, baby.
So Denver, you beat me to it.
That's what we want in the media.
Yeah. That's what gets the clicks. That's what gets the views, Aaron. Denver. Bo Nix, man. Cool story. I watched him against Baltimore this past weekend. He missed a couple guys for walk-in touchdowns.
I'm having a really hard time getting over my priors that Bo Nix is bad. Bo Nix might be average and reasonable for a rookie. And I'm having a hard time getting to that point. But their defense has been really good. And Surtain has been really good this year. And Zach Allen has been really good this year.
What are you seeing out of their defense? Because I don't think anybody coming into the year had Denver as a top defensive, just based off personnel.
Zach Allen is going insane. Like any kind of advanced stat you have, Zach Allen has been crazy good. He's not someone anyone ever talks about. And Surtain has been really good. And Riley Moss has been good. And their defense is just playing really good.
Back to Bo Nix for a second. On the season, 63% completion percentage, 1753 passing yards, 8 touchdowns, 6 picks, 4 rushing touchdowns, rating of 79.6. You know, decent stats. They're not, you know, not crazy, not terrible. Everybody always loves to say, this is the one thing I want to get your opinion on this. For every rookie quarterback ever in the existence of the NFL after John Elway, everybody always says, well, they're having a better rookie year than John Elway. But John Elway is one of one, and John Elway's story is way different than anybody else's story.
John Elway isn't one of one. There's a number of players who had bad rookie seasons, who turned into stars. Donovan McNabb, Matthew Stafford, Jared Goff. Elway is not one of one.
Well, I guess one of one in terms of everybody always loves to compare to, because Elway's rookie season was especially bad. I mean, his was okay.
Not by my stats, not by advanced stats. Once you adjust for the era he was in, no, Stafford's was worse.
And when you say adjust for the era, just
way worse. Goff's rookie season was horrifying.
So let's expand on that. So when you say adjust for the era, just in terms of how many times they pass.
So every era averages at 0. I mean, Elway threw more interceptions because quarterbacks in 1983 threw more interceptions than they do now. That's just that's how quarterbacking worked back then.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up Jared Goff's. I really didn't remember Jared Goff. Yeah, I guess you're right. His was pretty bad. 54.6%. 1,000 yards, 1,100 yards, pretty much. 5 touchdowns, 7 picks, 26 sacks. Yeah, it was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Dang, Jared Goff, man, what a story. I'm happy for Goff. Cal kid, has been through a lot. I want to see him win a Super Bowl.
The idea of him as an MVP candidate is ridiculous.
Oh, you beat me to it. So I was going to go through some of these MVP odds with you. Goff right now, you can get him at plus 750 to win MVP.
Yeah, ridiculous. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm only one guy, but for people who know, I'm one of the voters. We have Detroit like 11th in pass offense. Like, I know he's not throwing any incompletions, but he's throwing a lot of 2 and 3 yard completions that are basically the same as incompletions. Like, he's been pretty good. But the idea that he's the most valuable player compared to some other quarterbacks, it doesn't make any sense. Just because Detroit is the best team doesn't mean that Jared Goff is the most valuable player.
So would that same logic apply to Mahomes? I guess it would be more so before last night's game.
Yes, the same logic applies to Mahomes.
So who's your current MVP?
Lamar Jackson. The guy I didn't vote for last year.
Who'd you vote for last year?
Josh Allen.
And
I was the only one last year. I was the only voter who didn't vote for Lamar Jackson. Right? He got 49 out of 50 votes. I was the one.
And what was your logic?
Lamar Jackson is the best player in the league. It's not even close.
What was your logic last year for voting for Allen?
Oh, Allen just had way better stats than Jackson. The Baltimore was just a better team. Allen was a better player.
Do you think we'll ever get to a point where a defensive player can win MVP? Why not just rename the award?
They change the definition of or name of the award. If you're going to call the award most valuable player, the most valuable players in football are quarterback. That's how value works. Unless you're going to say the most valuable, unless you're going to change the rules and specifically say the most valuable player compared to the average at his position, in which case that award should have gone to Justin Tucker at least once. But nobody would have ever done that. So you have to decide, is this award for value compared to the average at your position, in which case you're opening it up to things like kickers, or is it for the most valuable player, period, in which case it has to be a quarterback? Which is fine. Defensive players have Defensive Player of the Year.
Would you be in favor of changing the award? I don't know. Yes, I see the logic. Yes, the most valuable player is the quarterback. But then, why not just change it to the most valuable quarterback, the MVQ, and just vote on who the best quarterback was that year?
Because most valuable player means quarter. You don't need to change the name. That's just what it means. If you want to change the award and make it so that we are given the guideline that you should vote for the best player compared to the standard of his position, then I will vote for non-quarterbacks. Until then, it's a quarterback.
It's a quarterback's award. I went back last year, and the narrative around the MVP award was Purdy was in the conversation for a long time until the Baltimore game in SF where he threw 4 picks, and then he obviously fell off.
Baltimore had a couple of really good games that were on national television. But it's not most valuable player who has his best games on national television. It's most valuable player, period.
So you said Lamar so far this year is the MVP in your estimation. What you look at stats, what else do you look at? Like, what do you factor in to that vote?
I factor in whether people who I trust, who are film watchers, believe that this is a transcendent player versus a system player. It matters to me that the people who I trust, who are film watchers, believe that Brock Purdy is in some ways a product of his system. And it matters to me that Jimmy Garoppolo had great numbers in the same system. Not as good, but great numbers in the same system. That does matter to me when we're voting. Whereas Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson and Patrick are considered transcendent players who truly raise the teams around them. That does matter to me.
One last question, Aaron, and we'll let you go. When I think about team makeup and how to build a Super Bowl contender, in my opinion, there's really 2 ways that you can do it. I'm eager to hear your opinion on this. You either do what San Francisco did, which is, and not just San Francisco, obviously it's happened plenty of times, but rookie quarterback or quarterback on a rookie contract, you build the team around him. That's one way to build a Super Bowl contender. Another way is you get one of these top 5 guys like a Mahomes, like a Lamar, like an Allen, and let them basically take you to the Super Bowl. I don't see the value in paying a Purdy or a Dak Prescott 60 to 65 million because I don't think you can win with a let's say slightly above average quarterback just because of where it puts the rest of your roster.
About how good Prescott is when he is healthy, because he was last year. He was good enough. He was good enough to pay last year. I thought you were going to ask me about the difference between getting a rookie quarterback and then building around him versus building and then plugging in the quarterback. Like, do you build everything else and then plug in the quarterback, or do you get the quarterback first? Because we're going through that right now in New England, right? Like, the whole team needs to be completely overhauled, but the quarterback is there, right? As opposed to San Francisco, where they built this juggernaut and then found Brock Purdy, and all of a sudden it was like, look at what we've got. Boom. I don't know which is the better way to do it.
I guess the argument for building the team around and then plugging in a quarterback is, I guess the argument for that would be just the development of the quarterback, right? Because the concern is with a Drake May and the situation that he's in. You have a battle line. He gets hit one too many times.
The other problem, though, is that if you build the team and then plug in the quarterback, you may not have a pick high enough to get the quarterback. You may have a team that's 7-10 because you've got really good players around your Gardner Minshew. And so you don't have a pick that's high enough to get the stud quarterback, because finding Brock Purdy is pretty freaking hard. And usually you want like a top 5, top 10 pick to go out and get Drake May or Caleb Williams or Jaden A.
I don't see what's so difficult about picking a starting quarterback with the last pick in the draft, Aaron. That seems pretty straightforward to me. I mean, every team should be able to do that. Aaron, I have really enjoyed this. Always love picking your brain on NFL stuff. You are my go-to advanced stats guy. You are a great follow on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it nowadays. I lied to you. I said one last question.
The name of the site is Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it nowadays. That's actually what the name of the site is. That's the official name.
Yeah, I think if you just put in whatever you want to call it nowadays.com, it takes you to Twitter or X.
Like whenever somebody says whatever you want to call it nowadays, you know exactly what they're talking about, right? They're talking about Twitter.
Right. There's only one. Instagram has stayed Instagram. Snapchat has stayed Snapchat. They've all been consistent except for the one and only Twitter/X.com. Aaron, before you leave, Super Bowl matchup. We've seen the odds. We've talked about the stats. Gut feeling. What's your Super Bowl pick?
My pick before the season was San Francisco and Baltimore. It's hard to go off of that, but I think right now I'm leaning Detroit and Kansas City. But I feel like San Francisco and Baltimore are like the second most likely teams in each conference, so there's a good chance one of them makes it anyway. But I think if you told me I had to pick Detroit, I would pick Detroit and Kansas City.
Detroit, Kansas City. Heard it here first, folks. If that ends up happening, we'll go back to this clip and I'll say Aaron predicted the Super Bowl. Aaron, what else do you have to plug before we sign off? FTNFantasy.com. My site is FTNFantasy.com/DVOA. You really want to consider getting a subscription. There's tons of good data. DFS optimizer, really good picks, all kinds of stuff for other sports. I only do NFL. But FTN, the website, does other sports, and we're very successful when it comes to picking things like golf and women's basketball. Like there are advantages to be had in some of these sports that you don't think about as much, that I don't think about as much. And FTN has a lot of good data on it. FTNFantasy.com. Go check it out. Go follow Aaron on Twitter/X. All those links will be in the description. Aaron, it's always a pleasure chatting. Appreciate you coming on.
All right. Have a good night.